As it had in other parts of the world, slavery had existed in Africa for many years. In most regions, however, it was a relatively minor institution. The spread of Islam into Africa during the 7th century, however, ushered in an increase in slavery and the slave trade. African rulers justified enslavement with the Muslim belief that non-Muslim prisoners of war could be bought and sold as slaves. As a result, between 650 and 1600 AD, black as well as white Muslims transported as many as 4.8 million Africans, mostly prisoners of war and criminals, to the Muslim lands of Southwest Asia. Once there, these enslaved Africans worked primarily as domestic servants. In most African and Muslim societies, slaves had some legal rights and opportunity for social mobility. In the Muslim world, slaves even occupied positions of influence and power. Some served as generals in the army. Others bought large estates and even owned slaves of their own. In African society, slaves could escape their bondage in numerous ways, including marrying into the family they served. Furthermore, slavery in Africa was not hereditary. Thus, the sons and daughters of slaves were considered free. The first Europeans to explore Africa were the Portuguese during the 1400s. Initially, Portuguese traders were more interested in trading for gold than for captured Africans. That changed, however, with the colonization of the Americas. At first, European colonists in the Americas forced Native Americans to work their profitable mines and plantations. As natives began dying by the millions from disease, Europeans became desperate for new workers. To resupply their labor force, colonists in the Americas soon looked to Africa. Europeans saw several advantages in using Africans. First, many Africans had been exposed to various European diseases and had built up some immunity to them. Second, many Africans had experience in farming and thus could be taught large-scale plantation work. Third, Africans, strangers to the Americas, had little knowledge of the land and had no familiar tribes in which to hide. As a result, they were less likely to try to escape. In time, the buying and selling of Africans for work in the Americas, known as the Atlantic slave trade, became a massive enterprise. Between 1500 and 1600, nearly 300,000 Africans were transported to the Americas. During the next century, that number climbed to almost 1.5 million. By the time the Atlantic slave trade ended around 1870, Europeans had imported about 9.5 million Africans to the Americas. The Spanish took an early lead in importing Africans to the Americas. As early as 1511, a small number of Africans were working in the copper mines on Hispaniola. In time, Spain moved on from the Caribbean and began to colonize the American mainland. As a result, the Spanish imported and enslaved thousands more Africans. By 1650, nearly 300,000 Africans labored throughout Spanish America on plantations and its gold and silver mines. By this time, however, the Portuguese had surpassed the Spanish in the importation of Africans to the Americas. During the 1600s, Brazil dominated the European sugar market. As the colony's sugar industry grew, so too did European colonialists' demand for slaves. During the 17th century, more than 40% of all Africans brought to the Americas went to Brazil. By the time the slave trade ended, Brazil had received more than 3.6 million Africans. That was nearly 10 times the number of Africans who would arrive in North America. As the other European nations established colonies in the Americas, their demand for cheap labor grew. Thus, they also began to import and enslave large numbers of Africans. A majority of these slaves labored on sugar, tobacco, and coffee plantations in the Dutch, French, and English colonies in the Caribbean. As England's presence in the Americas grew, it came to dominate the Atlantic slave trade. From 1690 until the nation abolished the slave trade in 1807, England was the leading carrier of enslaved Africans. By the time the slave trade ended, the English had transported nearly 1.7 million Africans to their colonies in the West Indies. A much smaller number of enslaved Africans eventually arrived in what is now the United States. In all, nearly 400,000 Africans were imported to Britain's North American colonies. Once in America, however, the slave population steadily grew. By 1830, roughly 2 million slaves toiled in the United States. After being captured, African men and women were shipped to the Americas as part of a profitable trade network. Along the way, millions of captured Africans endured a dehumanizing voyage across the Atlantic. Many died on the way. Africans transported to the Americas were part of a transatlantic trading network known as the Triangular Trade. Over one trade route, Europeans transported manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa. There, traders exchanged these goods for captured Africans. The Africans were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean and sold in the West Indies. Merchants then bought sugar, coffee, and tobacco in the West Indies and sailed back to Europe to sell these products. On another triangular route, merchants carried rum and other goods from the New England colonies to Africa. There they exchanged their merchandise for Africans. The traders then transported the Africans to the West Indies and sold them for sugar and molasses. They then sold these goods to rum producers in New England. Various other transatlantic routes existed. In fact, the triangular trade encompassed a network of trade routes crisscrossing the northern and southern colonies, the West Indies, England, Europe, and Africa. The network carried a variety of traded goods. These included furs, fruit, tar, and tobacco, as well as millions of African people. The voyage had brought captured Africans to the West Indies and later to America, and North and South America, was known as the Middle Passage. It was so named because it was considered the middle leg of the transatlantic trade triangle. Sickening cruelty characterized this journey. In the bustling posts along the African coast, European traders packed Africans into dark holds of large ships. On board a slave ship, Africans fell victims to whippings and beatings from the merchants, as well as diseases that swept through the vessel. The smell of blood, sweat, and excrement filled the hold. African captives often lived in their own vomit and waste. Numerous Africans died aboard the slave ships from disease or from cruel treatment by merchants. Many others committed suicide by plunging into the ocean rather than to be enslaved. Scholars estimate that roughly 20% of the Africans aboard each slave ship perished during the brutal trip to the Americas.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.